Bonjour, bonjour tout le monde. C'est très émotionnel pour moi de parler après cet moment pour Ingrid Betancourt. I know that after experiencing, for all of us who had never met her, the efforts to keep her and her captivity in public view, we in Canada haven't done as much as I wish we had, but we certainly called on the world governments to do something on March 8th, International Women's Day. And we know as Greens that we share so much with her, but we have not shared anything like the suffering and the experience of her captivity. And it's difficult for me to switch gears immediately to the climate crisis, just to say that we must all hold her in our minds and our hearts and in our prayers, knowing that she will be free. I have been asked in 15 minutes to review the impacts of the climate crisis on communities, economies, peace, and international security. This is simply impossible. But in the time I have, I'll do what I can, recognizing that simply listing the impacts on communities around the world without discussing or analyzing would take more than my allotted time. So let me at least share the impacts in Canada alone, and even in this, a very selective account. In Canada alone, the impacts of the climate crisis are everywhere. Our glaciers in the Rocky Mountains and all the way to the Yukon are in rapid retreat, threatening a future water crisis. The Great Lakes, the levels of the Great Lakes are falling beyond any historic record. The St. Lawrence Seaway as well has gotten so low at times as to strand the boats on the river. In British Columbia, we have experienced a climate-caused insect epidemic. The cold, cold winters of British Columbia are a thing of the past, and the cold snap was, for many, many centuries, enough to keep the pine beetle, a small beetle that bores into the bark, from becoming epidemic. Because of the climate crisis, an area of forest in interior British Columbia, 2 times the size of Sweden, has now died. The decaying forest of interior British Columbia will next year release, in one of those very concerning positive feedback loops, the British Columbia forests will release as much carbon as the entire British Columbia economy because of the climate crisis. Not to mention the loss of habitat for mountain caribou, the loss of livelihood for communities. Increased severe weather events are seen across our enormous country, from flooding to severe and crippling ice storms to the first full-force tropical hurricane to ever hit Canada. That was in Nova Scotia in 2003. To heat waves that cripple our inner cities. These are now becoming the new normal, the new way of life. But it is in the far north of Canada that the climate crisis is its most evident, in our Arctic. The Arctic is melting. 2 million square kilometers of ice is gone. 10 to 20% decline in summer sea ice over the last 30 years. The remaining ice is thinner, posing a threat to the Inuit and their normal way of life. Last summer, for the first time, the legendary Northwest Passage was open. You can imagine the glee of those who think that in the climate crisis lies their opportunity for new economic wealth, a shorter shipping route, and a chance to get to the oil and gas below the Arctic ice. The Inuit are experiencing unheard of weather conditions. The little community of Sachs Harbor on Banks Island reported a number of years ago to the weather station far south in Edmonton that they had experienced something. The weather station said, it's not possible. They had the first ever Arctic thunder and lightning storm, and there were no words in Inuktitut to describe what they had seen. Neither are there words for the new species of birds and fish that are making their way to the Arctic. They are seeing a dramatic loss of permafrost. The ground around them is literally collapsing. And as the permafrost melts, it also, in another feedback loop, pulses methane to the atmosphere. Inuit villages will have to relocate because the ground around them collapses. Looking globally at impacts, I know that at a gathering of Global Greens, I don't need to convince anyone that with 30%, more than 30% by concentration, carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, than at any time in the last 1 million years, the impacts are severe and represent a clear and present danger. 20 years ago, I helped work on the first scientific conference, international scientific conference on the climate crisis. It was held in Canada. It was called Our Changing Atmosphere: Implications for Global Security. Scientists from around the world attended. One of the leading scientists who helped draft the declaration with which I will share one sentence with you, but was, of course, Sao Paulo's leading scientist, Dr. Jose Goldenberg. The consensus statement of this first international gathering of scientists started as follows 20 years ago. Quote, humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences are second only to global nuclear war. Unquote. There is no set end point for this experiment. Where we end up in this potentially suicidal, or indeed geocidal, experiment depends on when humanity, economies, and governments accept their responsibility to reduce greenhouse gas emissions substantially and urgently. But if all use of fossil fuels and all deforestation were to stop tomorrow, we have already changed our atmosphere such that we are certain of an unstable climate regime for at least a century. We could, with adequate resources and planning, neither of which have begun, adapt and particularly assist the poorer nations, developing countries, adapt to a changing climate. But there is no sign of stopping fossil fuel use tomorrow. If greenhouse gas levels continue to rise, we could, as we all know, face tipping point events, points of no return from which we will not be able to adapt, to which human civilization is put at immediate risk. 3 such events are discussed often. The potential collapse of the Western Antarctic ice sheet. This one body of ice comprises 3.2 million cubic kilometers of ice. It's a hard measurement to comprehend. 1 million cubic kilometers of ice, 3.2 million cubic kilometers of ice, is now being destabilized from its base with warmer waters. The Greenland ice sheet is also destabilizing. If either the Greenland ice sheet or the Western Antarctic ice sheet collapse, it changes the scientific projections of sea level rise from less than 1 meter to 4 to 5 meter sea level rise. If both collapse, double it. The third major tipping point event to which we are concerned is the potential for the Gulf Stream to stall from the waters that are fresh water off the melting ice, depressing the current. The Gulf Stream is now 30% slower than it was 30 years ago. As a security threat, this issue has received scant attention from governments. Strangely, the U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon, conducted a study. It was published, if you want to find some of the findings, in Fortune magazine in 2004. They discussed what would be, quote, a plausible scenario for abrupt climate change, the stalling of the Gulf Stream in 2010, from which they concluded climate change is a greater threat to global security than terrorism. Well, of course. And what is the government response to this? Canada, my own government, is currently, and I hope briefly, in the hands of a George Bush clone named Stephen Harper, and I am very hopeful it will not last long, this period in which Canada has repudiated our Kyoto targets and is moving to accelerate greenhouse gas production in the Athabasca tar sands. Globally, the International Energy Agency reported that if on current government commitments of all governments in the world, if they achieve them, in 2030, greenhouse gases will be 27% higher than in 2005, hitting the 550 part per million, doubling over carbon levels before the Industrial Revolution, condemning us to 3 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase, which we know inevitably becomes 4 degrees, which becomes 5 degrees, which becomes 6 degrees. It's unthinkable. We must avoid it. But to avoid it, the World Energy Outlook of the International Energy Agency calculates that to avoid hitting those numbers, which we must avoid, we need to ensure that the year 2015, just 7 years from now, is the last year in which global greenhouse gas emissions rise. In other words, they must peak no later than 2015 everywhere and come down sharply from there. That's what is required of us. The conclusion of this report by the International Energy Agency was the following, quote, "The primary scarcity facing the planet is not of natural resources or money, but time." Facing, confronting, and dealing with the climate crisis must be the central organizing principle of all governments. Some say it is impossible to avoid the 3 degrees Celsius, to avoid tipping points, to protect the climate and the atmosphere that has given all of us life. I do not believe that. Founder of the German Greens and someone with whom I had the great honor to work in the early 90s, Petra Kelly said, "We must in our generation accomplish the impossible, or we shall experience the unthinkable. To do the impossible is our task as Greens. Let other parties embrace the idea that politics is the art of the possible. We must be willing to accept the challenge of doing the impossible, knowing that the alternative is unthinkable. We must live the words of Ingrid Betancourt: "The future is green. It must be and it will be." Thank you. Merci. Obrigada.